Welcome back to our journey through the deep and often turbulent waters of theology. I am your friend, Dr. James. This is part 2 of our series on predestination. If you joined us for the last session, you know we laid the groundwork by looking at how the Bible uses the word predestination, which surprisingly is only a handful of times, and we touched on election and justification. It's fascinating that while the specific biblical vocabulary is sparse, entire libraries have been written on the subject. In this episode, we are diving into the 4 views on predestination. We'll be analyzing these perspectives based on the lectures of Dr. Ken Wilson, whose extensive research and scholarship, including his Oxford doctoral thesis, serve as the primary source for our discussion today. Much of what I'll be sharing with you is grounded in his analysis of these historical and theological frameworks. We're going to walk through these 4 views: that God ordains all things, that God knows all things, that God limits his power, and that God limits his knowledge. You might recognize these by their more academic labels: hard determinism, soft determinism, indeterminism, and open theism, which we'll group with process theology for our purposes here. We begin today with the view that God ordains all things, often known as the Augustinian-Calvinist view or hard determinism. To get our bearings, we have to look at the work of Arthur Pink, who famously argued that to say man is a free moral agent with the power to checkmate his maker is to strip God of his omnipotence. Essentially, in this view, if God isn't the one determining every outcome, he isn't truly God. This brings us to John Feinberg's presentation in the book Predestination and Free Will. Feinberg wants to be very careful here. He's trying to avoid the F word of theology, fatalism. He defines fatalism as the idea that things happen by an inherent necessity where even God had no choice but to create the world exactly as he did. Feinberg argues that his view, causal determinism, is different. He calls it consequent necessity. His logic is that before the world began, God did have choices. But once God made those choices and foreordained every single event in the history of the universe, everything follows as a necessary consequence. Now, if you're thinking that sounds a lot like fatalism with an extra step, you aren't alone. Dr. Wilson points out that this is essentially the same move Augustine made centuries ago. Augustine redefined fate to mean only astrology. If God did it, it wasn't fate. Feinberg's version is, it's not fate because God once had a choice, even if you never will. It's a bit like saying a skunk by any other name still stinks to high heaven. If God decisively inclines a human will to a predetermined result without that person's input, it's fatalism, no matter what label you slap on it. This is where we get into the non-free free will that Dr. Wilson critiqued in his doctoral work. Feinberg suggests that God uses non-constraining causes. This means God doesn't force you to do something against your will. Instead, he manipulates your will so that you want to do exactly what he decreed. Think of it this way. If a doctor implants a microchip in your brain that makes you desire to commit a crime, are you truly free because you wanted to do it? Most of us would say no. Yet this is the mechanical heart of hard determinism, a divine manipulation of desire that renders free will an oxymoron. If we follow this logic to its conclusion, we run into a massive wall regarding the origin of sin. In this system, God is the only efficient cause, the one who actually makes things happen. Humans are merely instrumental causes, like a hammer in a carpenter's hand. If God ordains everything, including sin, but we also say God is not the cause of evil, we are left with a massive contradiction. Proponents of this view often retreat into mystery here, claiming we just can't understand how a holy God ordains sinful acts. But Dr. Wilson argues this isn't a holy mystery, it's just wrong thinking. They often point to Ephesians 1:11, which speaks of God working all things according to the counsel of his will. However, if you look at the context, Paul is talking about the guarantee of the believer's inheritance and the redemption of God's people, not that God is meticulously controlling the rotation of a rooster's neck muscles or the commission of a murder. The text is being forced to carry a weight it was never meant to bear. It's helpful to see how other scholars have reacted to this hard determinism model. Norman Geisler was quite blunt about it, noting that Feinberg's view reduces to a determinism where we aren't actually free at all, making God ultimately responsible for evil. Bruce Reichenbach called it smoke and mirrors, pointing out that if our desires are never independent of God's decree, freedom is an empty notion. Perhaps the most piercing critique comes from Clark Pinnock, who noted that Feinberg's big mistake was following Augustine's lead in thinking God must control every tiny detail to be sovereign. Pinnock points to Luke 7, where Jesus says the Pharisees rejected God's purpose for themselves. If hard determinism is true, how is it possible for anyone to fail to be in God's will? In that system, everything that happens, every sin, every tragedy, is exactly what God wanted. That leaves us with a very troubled view of God's character. As we wrap up this second part of our series, it's becoming clear why hard determinism faces such steep uphill battles, both logically and biblically. It relies on Stoic and Manichaean presuppositions that Augustine brought into the church, leading to a Christianized fatalism that many find incompatible with the God of love and justice revealed in Scripture. Because of these logical errors, the inability to account for evil, the manipulation of the human will, and the misreading of key texts, we're going to set the hard determinist view aside. The good news, we still have 3 more views to explore as we continue our search for a biblical understanding of predestination. Next time, we'll move on to look at soft determinism and see if it offers a more coherent path. If you like this video, please share and subscribe. God bless you.